Good day, everyone. I'm Anna Uspinskaya from Virtual Concert Halls, and I'm delighted to invite again Katie Beardsworth from Polyphony Arts, the creator of the wonderful season Music Works with an exclamation point. Hi, Katie.
Hello.
Great to see you again this morning. It's afternoon for you, I get it. So today we're presenting the next episode of your creation Music Works season. I believe that's two episodes actually back to back, 15 and 16 with Julia Kogan. And these are two interesting episodes. I believe the first one we'll have a conversation where you interview Julia, and she's talking about the problems in the music industry which she encountered herself in her own career. And in the second episode, you both turned to Julia's proposed solutions and the ones she had applied in her own career, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So as happened a few times in when I've been recording these episodes, is that a guest and I have talked for a very long time and really picked apart some complex stuff. So with this case, we decided to split it into two episodes to make it for easier listening, but they're called 15A and 15B, so they are kind of part of the same thing. But so in the first one, Julia's a very experienced opera singer and has gone into detail about her honest experience of being an opera singer in this music industry in which we find ourselves, and the dark side, as we've called it. So I won't spoil the episode by giving an example, but you should definitely listen. And then we obviously always on Music Works, we want to talk about how things could be better. We don't just want to talk about what's wrong now. So we move on to talking remedies and solutions.
Yeah, and hearing from someone like Julia, who encountered a lot obstacles on her path to her career, and obviously she was able to solve a lot of those problems and overcome a lot of those obstacles. It's really important to hear from people who searched for solutions, applied different solutions, made mistakes, corrected the outcomes of mistakes, and was able to continue successfully. That's what we want to hear. Because there's plenty to complain about. What's important for today and tomorrow is what we as musicians can do to make it better for everyone. Because obviously the industry is suffering on all ends, and musicians are not happy with how it's running, but so are managers and educational institutions. There are just problems all across the board. And Julia, I was part of recording that episode, and I remember Julia is a stunning problem solver.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a very meaty episode, so I do hope you all enjoy.
And she's so humorous.
Oh, she is, yeah.
And she has such a sense of wit, and she's a beautiful artist and a gorgeous woman. I just loved that episode. It was just so fun.
Me too. It was such a joy to record.
Can you give us a little overview of what's coming in the next episodes, or your plans for a little farther out in the future?
Absolutely. So I finished recording all of this season now, apart from the Christmas special, which we are going to be agreed to announce. In fact, that we're going to do the Christmas special live on these channels, like we're doing this now, on the 17th of December at 1:30, our usual times. That's Thursday the 17th at 1:30.
That is 8:30 our usual time.
Yeah.
EST.
Yeah, so 8:30 EST, 1:30 UK time. I'm really excited about that. We've got some of our guests from the series that we've recorded already coming back to give us some messages about 2020, 2021, the festive season and so on. So that should be a really fun episode, so do catch that. And that will be released on our usual audio channels on the 20th. Coming up next, on these videos, we're up to, after we've released these ones, we have a session a really great episode that we recorded about the importance of musical community. It's about I speak to Rocket Opera, which is an opera company who's been providing an online opera karaoke, as they call it, platform, which is really a platform, a sort of safe space for singers to get together and sing with to each other, but not to exactly. And it's been really important
experiment, and be together and try out different roles and whatever they're preparing for the next. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have that, and then we have a couple more episodes to come after that as well before the Christmas special. So I'm really excited, and I'm now booking in for series 2, which we're going to start recording in January. So,
and that's exactly what I wanted to hear. I want to see season 2, and I believe our viewers want to see season 2 as well, because things are progressing forward, changing, moving, and new solutions. Well, new problems, of course, will be coming up, but new solutions. It's so great to hear from your guests how they are adapting and how they're able to change their approaches as the circumstances and everything is changing too.
Great. We have some great guests for season 2. We're going to talk about fundraising. We're going to talk about how to make money as a composer. There's all sorts.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We all want to know how to do all of that. Thank you, Katie, for creating this incredible series and this season. And it's such a pleasure to always have you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you, Anna.
And now to the episode.
Hello and welcome to Music Works, a podcast by Polyphony Arts. We're talking about the future of the classical music industry with some great guests. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Music Works, a podcast by Polyphony Arts. I'm Katie Beardsworth, and today I'm joined by Julia Kogan. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Katie.
Thank you so much for joining us. Julia is a soprano and screenwriter, and she and I have been working together for some time now, and she's come here to talk about the future of the classical music industry, right, Julia?
We're here to talk about the unknown. Now, we're actually here far more sinister and possibly more interesting thing, which is that we're going to talk about all the things that we haven't dared talk about in the past because we were quite rightly nervous that if we talked about all these things, we would never work again. So you're about to find out, at least in our limited experience, about the seedy underbelly of the classical music world and how the business of singing is quite different from the act of singing itself, which is noble, graceful, beautiful, enlightening, and all the rest. But the business of it is an entirely different cup of tea.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to talk about this. I feel like you're going to say all the things that many of us are not brave enough to say.
I really am.
Yeah, fantastic. So where would you like to start?
Oh, well, maybe you'd like to start by saying what led you to the business in the first place, and what your idea of the classical music world was when you began to work in it, and how it actually was compared to that let's say naive vision.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. Well, it certainly was. I've worked in classical music in almost every single job I ever had. I come from a classical music family, both my dad is a professional arts administrator, used to run the Northern Sinfonia, and so it's always been this kind of this thing that we do is to do music and work in music.
Oh, amazing. I didn't know that you were a second generation.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. And
so maybe it wasn't such a surprise to you.
Well, I think it was sort of accepted. I think that I went into music knowing that I was unlikely to make much money. as many people do. And I now have many views about that, both in terms of my own career and everybody else's as well, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I think I was always just kind of brought up with like the love of music, and we sort of just do it anyway, regardless of the impact on our lives, of that being our chosen career choice. I have other relatives who are professional musicians who've actively discouraged their children from going into professional music because of the industry. So there are definitely many viewpoints on this just within my family.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think that the various problems with the industry, the discrepancies, the unfairnesses, and so on and so forth, have been really evident from the word go. But obviously, you sort of work through it in your own way, don't you? So as a recent music graduate, getting my first job as an orchestra administrator, I was utterly prepared to be, the person in training, the person building their career, and so on and so forth, and the long hours and the outrageous demands on time and so on and so forth.
Yes.
That feels like a sort of rite of passage. And then as I've
Yes.
gone on, obviously sort of working behind the scenes, I've seen what it's like for artists and to try and have any kind of quality of life. And one of the reasons, I mean, I always wanted to be a professional singer, and I think there are many reasons why I'm not one, but one of the main ones was that I could never quite get my head around the touring lifestyle. And there's sort of like two ideas
Yes.
about what makes a life. Like, so one is that you sort of, grow up and start a family and buy a house and put down roots, and the other one being that if you want to be any kind of touring musician, that's really difficult. I think that was a really major factor in my discovering my love for the back end of arts.
Yes.
If that's how I can put it. Because I get to be involved in like brilliant projects and so on, but largely on my own terms. And I think that musicians don't get to operate on their own terms very often at all, and that finding that that point in which they're in their career, they can say, right, this is where I start to say this is my life and my career, and I'm because this is what I've essentially done. I've been through a sort of period of I want a career in music, so I will be at the beck and call of the people who are in charge. And then at some point I've said, now I want to be in charge. And that's the point at which I started my business and established all of the things that go with that.
So you brought up you've brought up a few very interesting points. The first is that even in the very lucky circumstance of success and of having work, what does that success actually mean, and what does that success actually look like? And it's important to say that it wasn't like this in the past. So it's a fairly new phenomenon that operatic soloists, travel all over the world. And generally speaking, there are exceptions to this in the German houses and in the Austrian houses, where singers are fest, which means that they actually have a steady job and sing an entire season with a particular opera house. For those of us outside that system, if you're lucky enough to have a job, what that means is that with every contract, you go to a new opera house and it all starts over again. And the typical contract, I suppose, runs anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 weeks, in my experience. And that is a very peculiar lifestyle. And I know some very successful singers who've paid a very high price for that. They've never gotten married, or if they have, their relationships have fallen apart. Many don't have children, and those with children hardly see them. And even if you are lucky enough to be employed, there is that. The second thing that you brought up, which is also crucially important, and as I've gotten older and as I've started to create my own content by writing, something that I find harder and harder a pill to swallow is that you're completely at the creative mercy of whoever's directing the show that you're in. I'm delighted to be at the creative mercy of composers because they're so kind and wonderful to singers, and you're swimming in a sea of genius output, and it's such a glorious feeling just to get to think about those things, and which is why I wanted to spend my life doing it. I just enjoy thinking about it so much. But then you are faced with directors who may or may not be good, and their will is law. You have no say. I wonder if people realize when they watch singers on an opera stage just how little control those singers have. There are exceptions for people of the stature of Pavarotti and company, but for us mere mortals who don't have that level of fame and power, it's the conductor and the stage director who rule. And so, to give you an example, I was working in a French opera house on a production of Ariadne of Naxos, Richard Strauss's opera, which I adore, singing my absolute favorite role of Zerbinetta. And the conductor had me emphasize words in German that were simply wrong. He was making incorrect decisions, and there was nothing I could do about it. He spoke no German, so it's whereas I did, and so there was no things like that. When you're young, you just swallow and move on. But as you get older, it really becomes more than a little frustrating. But those are the problems that one should be so lucky as to have. And I want to go back to what you said early on. Why did the part of your family who tried to talk their children out of joining them in this field, what were the specifics that they mentioned in trying to get
they will be constantly on the road.
Their offspring away.
Yeah, they'll be constantly on the road, and they'll make no money, and they'll never see their family. That was basically the upshot of it. And
I did meet someone recently.
Oh yeah, go on.
I was going to say, sorry to interrupt. I did meet somebody who said, "Oh, you're an opera singer. Opera singers are rich." I said, "Oh, in what really? In what universe?" Yes, yes.
Yes, the reaction to what people say when you say you're an opera singer is probably a podcast episode in itself of just like a compilation of the. I once had a really, really close friend of mine as an opera singer, and she got really annoyed with one of my husband's friends once, who was insisting that it just wasn't a job. He was like, "Yes, you sing opera, but what else do you do?" And I was outraged on her behalf as well, because you just think,
I've heard that many times.
Yeah,
heard that many times. Yes, yeah. Or you get my favorite and everyone else's. Oh, so have you ever been in the Phantom of the Opera? Which of course isn't an opera; it's a musical.
Although the even better version of that is, have you ever thought of going on X Factor?
I've had so many people say that to me, and also I've had friends who have tried to explain to me that Susan Boyle is the greatest singer in the world because she won the X Factor. And it's very hard to know where to start explaining. Yeah. Which leads us on to the all-important question of, is our business a meritocracy? And if not, why not?
Can you explain what you mean by meritocracy?
I mean, do the best singers win? Are the best singers the ones with the best jobs? Are the best singers the ones who are the most well-known? What determines within our own hierarchy in the profession? What do you, how does it work? Say, I expected my greatest disappointment in the profession is that I always thought it was a meritocracy. And what I have found, unfortunately, is that is not quite how it works.
No,
it's
absolutely.
It's a very political system.
Very.
And it's political at the level of the agencies as well as the houses themselves, because many times, especially having sung in France a lot, the French houses tend to be run by business school graduates who have no background in music at all. And so oftentimes you will sing for someone who looks at you with a bovine expression and has no idea at all technically what differentiates you musically from anyone else. And so the decisions are not based on any kind of musical know-how, really. It's very, very different. I know from singing from conductors. I was almost always hired singing for conductors, whereas singing for directors, it was a fairly hopeless setup. So there's on the level of the houses, but then Katie, maybe you could talk us through how the agencies work. There are very powerful agencies that are now meeting their end. And even though I feel terrible for the colleagues who have lost their agents and for the wonderful work they've done, they have also ruled our world with an iron and tyrannical fist. And do you want to explain how this works?
Well, I would love to. I have to say, you've asked me the question that I dread being asked because I've never worked for an agency until I ran one. So I don't 100% know how they... What I do know is that... and while we're being frank, I can say that I do think that the business model of agencies doesn't work well for them or for artists or for art at all, because and it's a big question that I get asked as an agent is I think I've written about this before, is that I charge fees rather than a commission. And I get quizzed about that all the time. And I have to explain, first of all, that it's not, a con and so on and so forth, and that actually when you get a commission, you are still paying the person to do the stuff. It's just arranged differently, and often the commission percentages are much higher, and that's money that could be in the artist's pockets. But also, that does mean that, in times of no performances, I am able to continue to work for people. And this is what we're seeing at the moment, unfortunately, is a huge problem with the agency world, because they aren't able to make the money in the way that they did before. And so there's a lot of redundancies and a lot of there are agencies closing and so on and so forth. And I think in many ways this is indicative of part of the problem. It's not the whole of the problem, but it's definitely part of the problem with classical music as a whole, which is what I feel the pandemic has brought up, is that it's all based around live performance happening and people being paid on a gig by gig basis or a contract by contract basis for things that they're doing. And it doesn't provide anybody with any stability, really, as a whole. Obviously, there are big companies, there are big artists, there are people who have stable lifestyles from music, but the percentage of those people as against the whole industry, I would say, is quite low. And in general, we have a system where it is the gig economy. It is the definition of the gig economy for everyone involved.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's if we take the whole thing a step back and look at two things. There are very successful gig economies, as we know from rock music, and as we know from something far closer to opera, which is the West End. So anything to do with musical theatre, that's quite a successful gig economy, though they're suffering a great deal now as well. But it's successful because a show in the West End runs until there is no more audience for it. It runs until it fails naturally. Whereas in the opera world, many years in advance, opera houses schedule their seasons, and they only schedule a few performances, which are very, very expensive to put on. So each new production is hugely costly, and yet that the most you will ever make on it are the seats that you will have sold very, very quickly for performances that people want to see at the Royal Opera House, for example. And there are only 6 of those performances, or 8, and that's it. Whereas in fact, that show could run for a year, and that's where the real money kicks in. And also the singers are paid much less per performance in the West End, and they sing many more performances. But because they have a steady job and get to stay in one place for quite some time, they're actually far better off as a result. And there is some sort of give and take between the actual market and your expenditure, which is crucial. And the other thing, to go back to the all-important issue of the great artist agencies, is that the most famous artists command huge fees, and the most powerful agents have those artists on their rosters. They also have rosters full of underlings. And when an opera house wants one of the very few singers in the opera world who have name recognition, there are only a few handfuls of singers with real name recognition, they engage with the agency that has that singer on their roster. And when they do that, the agency has a vast amount of power to force that opera house to use the singers on their roster. And it's why it is so difficult for independent agents and also singers who are not on the rosters of those few agencies to get a job, absolutely irrespective of their artistic merit. And that's why Katie and I are only partly sad at the demise of some of the great agencies that are now going under, because I think we both hope that it will open the door to a more meritocratic system.
Oh, absolutely. And I just think the thing that I think is sad is people losing their jobs and musicians losing their support at a time when they need it most. And that's what I just think is the most easily criticized thing about the model that the agencies are working on, is that at the time when they're the most needed, they're the least able to provide that support because of the way the financial model works.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's Sod's law. Yes, precisely. It's Sod's law.
Yeah.
And it has flagged up all, as you say, all the inadequacies of our world. I would be very curious to find out how much money has been generated by selling the streaming of productions of the past. I know that in the West End on Broadway, a great deal of money has been raised in that way. So for those of us who've wanted to see whatever shows in the West End that have been booked for many years in advance, it's now possible to pay a little bit and see those online.
Yeah, there's been a strange turn with classical music as well, in which a lot of it has been made available for free.
Yes, well,
I think that this is something that I talk about all the time. I think there are various different types of content, and there is certainly a place for free online content, sort of. But where an opera house, I think that to my knowledge, the process they'll have gone through is, we've already done this production, filmed it, spent all the money, that's all happened. People are missing opera, so let's put it on the internet and then people can enjoy it. And I think that's really nice. Like, that's, people really enjoyed that when lockdown first started. But what other art forms, like for example the Disney Channel did, and I've taken this from a blog post that I read, this is not my idea, but this came from something that I read, was that they put like a slight discount on the big offering of Disney films, the big channel that they were going to release anyway, and released it and made a ton of money, as far as I know. And the thing is that the problem isn't so much with presenting free content as that it just makes a statement about the value of music. And I think that the classical music industry over and over again makes statements about its own value. And it's like, if you don't value yourself, no one else is going to value you. And so when major opera houses say, here's some free content, and actually after we've had this out for a month, we might start charging for it, by which point probably most people that wanted to see it have already seen it. That says something completely different from the other industries who are like, here's some great stuff and everyone's going to buy it. Off you go.
Well, there's a very good reason for that. There's a very good reason why we don't have so much content to sell. And it's because we live in a museum. And this is also something that is new. I wonder whether people realize that in the 18th century, the 19th century, until well into the 20th century, probably from the second half of the 20th century onwards, the operas that were mostly put on were brand new operas. So just like with a film, there was a season where new works would come out and be presented, and those works had value as a novelty, as a new work of art that then people had to go see. We don't have that at all, because we are putting on the same productions of Bohème that everyone had seen. And as lovely as it is to have a certain cast or another cast, it's basically same old, same old. And the reason we have that is that so much contemporary classical music is unpleasant to listen to. And it's horrible to admit, as someone who has recorded and sung a lot of contemporary music, and I adore contemporary music, and I champion it, and just couldn't feel more strongly about the need to create new music and to perform new music and to record it. I have to admit that to my ear, over 90%, and I'm being generous here, of new music, I really don't understand whom it's written for. Essentially, I think people who go, and I sometimes I've had experiences where I've sort of sat in the audience listening to something that I wasn't enjoying on any level, and I look around to see the expressions on people's faces, and I see that there's a kind of peer pressure to enjoy it in an intellectual kind of we are smart enough to lie. It's not emotionally engaging content, and this is entirely our fault in the classical music world. So there's a great deal of complaining that we're very marginalized and not enough people listen to classical music. But there are many different kinds of music out there that are hugely engaging and entertaining of all sorts. For people who are not particularly pretentious, they're quite happy to listen to those kinds of music and get all the fun that they want out of that without turning. So we have to actually provide something that people want. Shock and horror. What? What? We have to entertain people? What a crazy notion. But we do. We really have to.
We have got in a muddle, haven't we? Again, about, yeah, we've got in a muddle about art and culture and entertainment, yes, and the relationship between those things, I think. Obviously, I know that you're an advocate for contemporary music, and I know that I am as well. So therefore, I feel that we can say these things. But they are. Yes. You do. I mean, it's a little bit like for me, when you go to a modern art gallery and everyone's wandering around going, and you're sort of thinking, is that a I love it, or why am I looking at a sort of, I don't know.
I have to tell you this anecdote. Because it so perfectly exemplifies what we're talking about. A friend invited me to the Tate Modern for a new exhibition, and it was the press day, so it was before it was open to the public. And so we had a curator who was explaining the works of art to us, and I walked into a large hall, we all did, and there was a shoebox, an empty shoebox sitting on the floor, and next to it was a security guard. And I asked the curator why the security guard was there, and she said, it's so that nobody mistakes it for an empty shoebox and throws it away. And it really is that sort of the emperor's cloak, the emperor's naked situation.
Yes, if we call it art, it is art.
If we call it art. But the audience is not stupid. This is the problem. Yeah. The audience is not stupid at all. Audiences love to be moved and entertained. And if we cannot do that, someone else will.
But just to go down this route for a moment, though, because there is a train of thought that says that if you're still talking about it, then it's had an impact and therefore it has an artistic value. And I suppose the difference between the shoebox and a contemporary opera is that the shoebox you could potentially look at for about 45 seconds and then say, right, okay, I've now experienced that and I may always remember it because it's...
So you say.
However, a contemporary opera is somewhat more of a commitment. Both in terms of
so that's purely in the realm of disadvantage.
Well, quite exactly.
I had a friend friend who said he went to the Bastille to watch a contemporary opera. When he entered, he sat down in his seat, and the curtain was already drawn, and on the stage were 45 heads. So they had dropped the level of the stage down, and the singers just had their heads from the neck up. And for the next 3 hours, that is how that stage remained. And he said, I'm just not smart enough to understand this opera, and never went to another contemporary opera again. So
that's difficult as well, though, isn't it?
Quite.
Because,
but
one contemporary opera could ruin them all.
Yeah. That's why it's so important. It isn't, in the days of Mozart, in the old days, it was very much the law of the jungle. Your opera opened. If it was not a success on opening night, it closed. And when I say success, it wasn't critical success. It was people in the rafters who brought food and rotten vegetables to fling at you if they weren't happy. And it was that direct, that immediate, the response. And there was no question about the need to have entertainment value in the content. It was very, very clear. But this brings us to another question. So if it's not the audience and their enjoyment who determine what new works of art, because I don't want anyone to imagine for a moment that we don't have genius composers out there, or genius directors, or genius singers, or genius actors. We have more talent out there now than I believe we've ever had in the history of humankind. There's so many people from various backgrounds getting that education who could never have dreamt of that before, whether it's stepping out of their own classical music traditions into the Western classical music traditions. So we have outstanding singers from all over the world, and we have more classical composers than we've ever had, and many of them are great, great talent. So I would say that the difficulty comes in separating out the entertaining pieces of lasting value and what is somehow commissioned by the establishment, which is a very, very strange thing. So the way these things work, in order to have a piece performed, a new piece performed at something like the Royal Opera House or wherever it is, generally it has to be commissioned by the house. It's a very expensive thing to do because commissions at that level cost a fortune. Whoever are the reigning composers get those commissions, and it's all quite a mysterious process. So there are very, very few new works because they are so expensive to put on, and those works are not judged before they're put on a stage. So if the work has been commissioned, it will, regardless of what actually is written then beyond the commission process, it will find its way to the stage, whether it's good or not, and it will play for the exact number of performances that it's been scheduled to play. And so it's what I have found as someone who's commissioned. I've had a great deal of works written for me from composers who I think are the sort of genius composers of our time, most of whom, surprise, surprise, are unknown. So the first time I was offered the opportunity to commission new works was working with an orchestra that used to be called Chamber Orchestra Kremlin, a Russian chamber orchestra that has nothing to do with the Kremlin, and I think are now called the Moscow Chamber Orchestra, something like that. But an absolutely outstanding string orchestra, and I was able to commission 8 different composers to write pieces for me. And so when I began choosing my composers, I decided that I would open the field to the entire world. And I began by looking up the winners of all the most prestigious composing competitions. So there are many competitions around the world for composers. And what I found was that is not where you go looking for the great composers, which is a huge a huge irony in and of itself. One of my all-time favorite composers, and the composer who's written the most for me, was a chap called Eskander Bekmambetov. Quite a mouthful. But he did indeed win the audience prize at a competition judged by Naxos, the recording label. And he was absolutely outstanding and wrote a lot for me. But it's very surprising what is now considered as the sound of today, and why people feel the need to make such a judgment. An excellent example of this was my last recording of the songs, the art songs of Isabelle Aboulker. So Isabelle Aboulker, who is, to my mind, the greatest living song composer. And she writes in a kind of post-Poulenc style, so very French, but a style entirely unique to her. And it's extremely warm, it's remarkably varied, and we were delighted this year when our CD was chosen the classical CD pick of 2019 by the Arts Desk. So that was really wonderful. I was so glad that someone could hear the tremendous lasting value of her artistic input into the field.
Incredibly well deserved. It's a fantastic disc.
Thank you very much. But Isabelle struggled for decades to get a single one of her pieces heard. And the reason for that was that Isabelle, who's now in her 80s, she ran headlong into the contemporary music movement in France, which was led by Pierre Boulez, a very great composer, but who imposed his own aesthetic and his own school of thinking on the whole of France. And for decades, she wrote letters trying to get her pieces performed. And she was turned down everywhere she went for the crime of writing tonal music. It was deemed that tonal music was too old-fashioned for France. And her genius compositions were ignored because they were too entertaining and too accessible. Adjectives that very rarely describe contemporary music today, unfortunately.
Or things that are undesirable. Anyway.
Oh, the shame. If you want contemporary music that is accessible and entertaining, the place you have to go now is film scores. I always laugh when people tell me that they don't like classical music, because everyone loves classical music, and I can prove that everybody loves classical music because everyone loves film scores, and film score music is contemporary orchestral music, much of it of a post-German Romanticism kind, introduced into Hollywood by the refugees coming from Europe in the 30s and 40s. So there you go.
Absolutely. So do you think that, so I have a view that audiences get either forgotten or misunderstood constantly in our kind of quest as classical musicians or music organisers to find success. You know, I completely agree with what you're saying about entertainment, but I also
we don't ask, do we?
Well, we don't ask. We simultaneously make assumptions and also cling to our art at the same time. So it's like we produce a lot of very kind of esoteric, complex, not necessarily enjoyable to listen to music, and then we bemoan the fact that nobody wants to listen to it. Simultaneously, we don't challenge audiences enough, I don't think, because we don't put on things that are contemporary, entertaining, good to listen to, or trust them enough to understand that it'll be good. Because also, you know, there's sort of like this idea that if you have a contemporary piece for a program, you have to kind of sneak it in between the Brahms and the Beethoven, and then they might just enjoy it if they don't know it's coming. I'm obviously talking more concert programming here.
Absolutely.
And you know, I don't think
but
that
both.
Yeah. The simultaneously we sort of don't allow people to be intelligent and creative and understand what's great about new music, and simultaneously we keep it niche. And I think that the nicheness of the classical music industry is its most enormous failing. And it never used to be like that. I mean,
Absolutely.
we talked about the
No.
operas of Mozart and so on. It was always for the masses and for mass enjoyment, as anything entertainment related should be. And somehow we've ended up in a place mostly where everything is, you know, beset by ritual and a sort of cliqueiness, which is just unforgivable in my opinion.
Yes.
And
Yes.
really damaging. I mean, I will qualify that by saying there are tons of organisations who are trying to do exactly not that and make sure that they're doing things that are good. But in the main, I still think there are probably at least as many people who don't listen. For every person who loves classical music now, I reckon there's at least one, if not many more, who would but don't know they would because of the way it's presented to them.
I think that's undoubtedly true. And I've when my sons were small, I would go into their schools and sing, and the children are always absolutely bowled over. I sang years ago for the Opéra d'Avignon, so the Avignon Opera House, and they had a wonderful system of busing in children, especially from underprivileged areas. And in France, they do this quite regularly. They have a matinee for school children. And it was absolutely marvelous to see the reaction on the kids. It was a Magic Flute production that we did with the Amsterdam Puppet Theatre. So it was fantastic. There were singers on stage and there were the puppets. So we were all enacting the opera live as it was being enacted on the stage within a stage. So quite entertaining for children. And I asked one little girl, what was your favorite part after the show? And she said, it was when you were screaming. It was just perfect. Sometimes saying the Queen of the Night, and I really was very angry and very mean. But children are entirely capable of judging, and it's just such a shame. But you see it everywhere. The bias against classical music as something stuffy, as something old, as something unexciting, and it's constantly held up as the antithesis of pop music, which is full of energy and vivacity and something to get people excited about. And people will often tell me, if I want to relax, I put on classical music, and that just makes me wild, because I can't think of anything less relaxing. I specifically stay away from classical music if I need to calm down, because it's just too moving, it's too emotionally engaging. And it is that because of its enormous richness and complexity, and variety and depth and all the things that it is kind of the most fulfilling and gratifying music that there is, because it digs deeper than any other kind of music. So I don't buy for a minute that people wouldn't enjoy it if they were introduced to it. And I've also had many people tell me, I've always wanted to learn about classical music because I didn't grow up in a home that played it, but they have no idea where to begin. And there was something
it's so huge, isn't it? I mean, where do you begin?
It's so intimidating. It's so big. Where do you begin? And it's quite intimidating, and it is intimidating because of all these stuffy rituals, as you say, and the way it's presented. The voice of the presenter today. It's all of this that scares people and puts them in their place, and the proof is in the incredible popularity of people like Catherine Jenkins and Andrea Bocelli and all the quote-unquote crossover artists. It is what people who don't really understand what opera singing is or what it does, it's who they listen to when they want to hear what they think is opera. And everyone loves, there's your X Factor, Nessun Dorma. Who hasn't heard Nessun Dorma? Everyone's heard it, everyone loves it. That's one aria of very many. And I always tell people, just for God's sake, please listen to the Pavarotti version before you tell me anything else, and compare the two. Listen to them side by side, all right? And then you'll immediately see what opera is and what it isn't. But there is.
I think that this comes to something.
There has to be a way.
there's something about the complexity of classical. Oh, I think we've got out of sync. Sorry. Let's resync.
Yes, we're out of
Let's
sync.
give it a moment.
Resync.
I'm talking over you by mistake. Okay. I think do you think we're in sync now?
I think
we
so.
are. Yeah. Well, I just think people in general are more than capable and want to enjoy complex, deep things. And there's this sort of, and not always, that not, we all love something that's not too complicated and so on and so forth. But I think there's a sort of a bewilderment by the amount that goes into classical music, because everyone seems to think it's something that you need an education to enjoy, which is not at all true.
Not at all.
Not at all. And everyone, and there is a lot to it. Producing an opera is a completely different kettle of fish from producing even an album of pop music, never mind a song. However, they're two completely different things, not necessarily for comparison. But the process of producing, for example, an opera is fascinating, and it is, if it's seen as like interesting and deep, that's a lot different from being like, oh, couldn't even possibly, begin to get into that, And again, I think the industry puts this forward. I think it is murky and hidden and confusing, whether it's on purpose or through major lack of foresight. I just think these things are great.
Whichever it is, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, definitely.
Yes, that is. I think one of the great misconceptions that people have about opera, and this is, again, it's our own fault, is that it's artificial. It's the artifice of it that puts people off. And people don't realize that, paradoxically and remarkably, opera singing improves it correlates to how the quality of it correlates to how natural it is, or how naturally produced it is. So now we're going to get into just a tiny little bit into classical technique, which unfortunately is something that's getting a little bit lost. But it's really very, very important, because it has, not because of any abstract reason of what's right and what's wrong, or which school prevails, but because for my ear, for me, it's just not entertaining or interesting to listen to people who sound artificial. And what I mean by that is specifically the kind of stereotypical opera sound. So when you say to a child, what does an opera singer sound like? And they go, blah, blah, blah. And then you go to the opera house and you hear exactly that, but that isn't what good opera singers sound like. Good opera singers sound completely natural, and that is what bel canto is. There is a school of singing that was developed in Italy in the 17th century that for me is still the one and only great school, and the only reason it's the one and only great school is that it's the one that maintains complete naturalness. So there are technical tricks to making that sound focused. There are technical tricks to essentially turning the inside of your head into the opening of a trumpet, acoustically speaking. But you do that by keeping the sound exactly as you're speaking. So your speaking voice and your singing voice are one and the same. And there's no blah or anything like that. So I think for me, and if you look at any of the great singers of bel canto, Joan Sutherland, Birella Freni, Pavarotti, and many, many others, that is what they all have in common, and that is why they're so touching, and that's why we can't get enough of looking at them and listening to them, because the sound is so direct, heart to heart. And that's also a very important point if we want some audience members to turn up who are not from the little clique.
Absolutely, and it's not lost on audiences. I don't think they might not be able to explain it like you just have, but they do hear it and see it and feel the change, the difference in connection. I think certainly, and And if you want to, the big picture of the misunderstanding about singing has been the investigation that's gone into whether or not it's safe to sing in an enclosed space since COVID became, and it took however many studies and experts to point out that when you sing, you control your breath far more than you do when you're speaking. And so, the idea that there'd be this massive outpouring of breath as a result of an opera singer singing is just kind of crazy.
It's hilarious. It's hilarious
Yeah.
because, a single sneeze will carry more particles. It's kind of a moot point altogether. Because
Completely.
there's just too many banal things that we do, like sneezing, that render us more dangerous than any kind of singing ever could. So right
well,
there.
Absolutely.
It's kind of
There's a really funny video on
lost
YouTube of a
cause.
trombonist trying to blow out a candle through his trombone. Wait, is it? Yeah, no, it is a trombone, and obviously it's completely impossible.
Did it work? Is it?
Yeah.
Because
you're
case in point.
Yeah.
Case in point. So let's talk remedies now. Let's talk remedies. What can we do now that we've complained bitterly? There was a remarkable thing that happened for decades in America that I would dearly love to start again. And I know that Tony Papano at the Royal Opera House has started barking up that tree, I think very successfully. There used to be something called, is it the Bell Hour? There was a telephone company that sponsored on American television a program of opera clips. So the great singers of the decades that this program was aired, they would take a single aria from one of their best known roles, and that aria would be kind of semi-staged and performed in front of the camera. And so what that gave everyone was this very intimate experience of the singer being filmed quite close up. But because you only got a few minutes of an opera at a time, it was a taster, a kind of taster that engaged people like nothing else, and they sold an incredible number, many millions of records that way, because those hits then were put out on LP and as little singles. And opera singers in America for a long time were household names across the board because this was done. And it's just such a clever thing to do. I think for people who are not opera initiates or fans and don't really know their way around, the best thing you can do is to do a top of the pops best of in this very engaging way, but also with a huge amount of variety in every program, and little snippets, little tidbits that they can enjoy, and that just kind of become this kind of pathway into that entire world. And I think that doing something like that would make a huge difference.
I really agree, and it's so that fits with the way we know people consume content. Yeah. Now on the internet. Obviously at the time when this was done, it wasn't how it was consumed at all, but in that sense maybe it makes me feel as though things haven't changed as much as we think they have, and that what people need is quality brief introductions to really highlight why this is an incredible, special and beautiful thing that provides value and is interesting and entertaining.
Fundamentally, they have to be able to say, that's a nice tune. Wow, that's a really... Nessun Dorma is a beautiful melody. God, how gorgeous. And I know I'll listen for 5 more minutes. And then and there's a way of stringing people along in that very basic kind of way of gripping them. And that would make a huge difference to bring it to people in that way.
Well, I mean, people who haven't experienced it yet, they can't really just go from never listening to classical music to going to a 3-hour long opera performance. Why would you do that? Especially people who already have we talk a lot about engaging children, and rightly so. And I think children can watch things and with none of the assumptions or kind of like I don't mean assumptions, do I?
Yes, prejudices.
Yes, prejudices
Preconceived
that
notions.
adults have got. Yeah, exactly. But I've got a few friends who I met because I have a young son who aren't into classical music, but because I am, they've listened to a bit with me, this and that, will come to the odd concert with me, or found one which the kids can come to or whatever, and then they're suddenly saying, oh, I really loved that cello piece, what else can I listen to that's like that? And I'm kind of going, oh, right, okay, and trying to go from there. So, and these are kind of really, it's a really nice way in to be able to say, oh, actually I've just heard this thing that I like, so here's my way in, here's how I'm going to find out what else I like.
For children, one album I've meant to record for many years now, and I really must do it quite soon. I think that most people don't know that the world's greatest composers wrote songs for children, not to be sung by children, but to be sung to children. And I've put together a fantastic compilation of those songs, and they're incredibly entertaining. They're very short. They're extremely varied, and just utterly delightful. And the only time these songs get performed, irony of ironies, is at the end of recital programs after you've been bored to tears with all the serious stuff. When people want to entertain, they pull out the repertoire that was written specifically for children, and it never fails to entertain. And I think that really fancy that, and it really must be recorded and diffused in some way. So I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff out there that people just have absolutely no idea about at all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
and again, that's our fault. It's our task to change that, isn't it?
Well, the amount of music. This is the thing. We get into assumptions that the audiences want to hear the same thing over and over again, and the amount of music that either is never performed or is so rarely performed, as against a tiny fraction that's performed all the time, is absolutely incredible. It's completely baffling.
It is incredible.
Really, do we really need like all those messiahs every single Christmas? And all of this kind of. But then it's like you said. I mean, I think your analogy with the West End is really interesting, though, because if there is a market for constant Messiah, then there probably should just be constant Messiah. And if there is a market for, always having these things at Easter, Christmas, and so on, and now, people are always, when they write new things, they're often thinking, how can we hook people into this? It's like they write companion pieces to go with things like really famous chamber work so that they can be programmed together, because otherwise the worry is, the very real worry is that they will never get programmed, especially if they've got complex ensembles, because, if you take like the number of companion pieces to like the Schubert octet, because like once you've got an octet, you need to keep using the octet because it's too expensive to have a program like that and not have the octet fully utilized. So I've slightly lost my train of thought here, but there's a sort of pragmatism to the way we're using music, which isn't necessarily
it's tricky, isn't it? Because you're right.
Service.
It's a very tricky balance to strike, because the people are paradox again. People absolutely are very risk averse, and people love the familiar. People are terrified of the unknown. So yes, they do want to hear the same things over and over and over again, and at the same time, they want to be entertained, and they love the discovery of the new. And it's funny, if you look at the world of technology, that's the one place, even though most people are very technophobic and are frightened of actually learning how to maneuver new devices, but that industry has managed to, because of people like Steve Jobs, who said they have no idea what they want until I give it to them. And it's absolutely true. People don't know what they want, me included. They don't know what they want until they're given it. But for that to be possible, you have to have trust. And for trust to be possible, you have to know that when you go to hear or see a new piece being performed, that piece is going to knock your socks off, and that you're actually privileged, just like in the good old days when Mahler would play his new symphony, and the audience, you had to fight people off for tickets because they couldn't wait to hear what new symphony Mahler had written, because they knew it was going to be exciting and push the frontiers. It was captivating and rich and all of that. It's that sense of urgency that we need to build by creating content that is irresistibly appealing to audiences, and
absolutely, and just beyond the music as well, I think, because obviously actually it's more possible now to know what new music is going to be like before you commit to buying a concert ticket or a CD, because you can hear a clip online or whatever. More possible now than it ever used to be. But also it's just I was just thinking about what you said about trust. Trust is a two-way street. So if we want audiences to trust us, we have to trust them to respond well to things, which to me means not over-prescribing when they clap, what they wear, when they drink things, when they eat things, all of this kind of thing.
I agree.
The more
How do you see it? So what would be so talk to me about that, because I'm very interested in this. I personally have for decades, I more than anything would prefer to go see a dress rehearsal than a performance, because firstly, I get overexcited about everything, and if I'm seeing something I love, I'm embarrassing. So I just want to have a bit of space around me to feel it, to experience it fully, and not to be, locked in a state of silence and try to keep my face steady, and the tissues, well hidden, and all that kind of thing.
Else do we consume and enjoy and have to do so with a straight face anyway? Really,
this is it. You want the freedom. So what should it look like? What's the ideal experience?
I think, and I say this I know that music is essentially audio, and that we do get more from silence sometimes, and there are moments like a Messiaen quartet for the end of time when really you just want everyone to sit and be utterly silent so you can absorb the wonderful sound of it. But in general, or certainly within that, there's a place for people just need to be able to relax. And I will say, and I know this isn't everybody, but I would personally like to be able to go to something without panicking about whether the first half is going to be too long and I'm going to need to go to the loo before it's finished. Secondly, I would like to be allowed to drink my wine while I'm watching it, because I like wine, especially with a little one. When I go out in the evening,
why not?
I need to be able to do those things together, because there's only so much time.
Yes.
And I don't have any disabilities. I don't have any kind of major constraints like that. But this gets more serious when you think about people who can't sit still for an hour and a half and need to move around and are more likely to need to use the loo and so on and so forth. Those people are massively, massively excluded from attending the vast majority of performances. Yeah. The vast majority of performances.
And if you're talking about children, Sorry, I was just going to say that, just to interject, if you're talking about hyperactive children, for example, hyperactive children benefit more than anyone from this kind of experience, and yet they're excluded by virtue of exactly this constraint, because they have to be.
I know that we've already talked about all classical music.
That's crazy.
I keep talking over you. Sorry, I keep talking.
Go ahead. No, I'm
sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. We're in sync. Yeah.
Oh, good. Children can't sit still, and we need them to be able to listen to classical music so that we can carry on having classical music in the future, because if they like it when they're kids, they'll like it when they're adults, hopefully, especially if we give them a good experience. But then when they go, we have to tell them to be quiet, and we have to tell them they can't have a snack until the interval, and all the things that as a parent, it's a complete nightmare. And then we carry on doing it to adults. I mean, it's just crazy. And I've told this story before. I've already recorded a podcast episode in which I've told this story, but I don't know what order I'm releasing them in. And maybe not everyone's going to listen to them in like a massive series. So I'm going to tell it again because it's so important. I went to a orchestral concert with my dad, and it was the 60th gala thing for the Northern Symphonia, and it was lovely because we had those seats that people have when they're the invited guests, and they sit really near the front where the view's terrible, but because they're important, that's where they sit. And I never, yeah, exactly, just like crack neck. And I never do that. It's actually quite unusual for me to go to an event at all that I'm not involved in running. So to go as a member of the audience at all is fairly unusual for me. But to go as a kind of posh guest was really, really good. And my dad is almost certainly listening to this. He's 81, and this was a few years ago, and he has worked in music his whole life, and he's enormously passionate about it, and he cannot listen to a piece of music without moving, which, funnily enough, given that music is, that's literally what it's for, is unsurprising.
Yes.
So he has to tell, he's the kind, he'll have Radio 3 on in the car, and he'll be conducting along with it or whatever. And he was sat next to me in this concert, and he was sort of, doing a little bit of movement, nothing outrageous. He definitely was not causing a disturbance. He was just, he wasn't talking, and he wasn't making any noise, but he was just reacting to the music. And I knew that, he was probably crying and all of this. And I kind of was giving him the odd occasional, smile and just saying, I'm enjoying it too, without words. Anyway, someone in the row behind me tapped me on the shoulder and shushed me. Literally, shh. And I was absolutely furious because, first of all, I wasn't the one making the disturbance. It was my elderly dad, who is not a candidate for shushing by another man, but I am. And secondly, obviously I'm like me, and that's fine. But if I'd been younger me, if I'd been me 10 years ago, or if I'd been someone who doesn't normally go to classical music, I may very well have never gone again, because that's really embarrassing. And even though I'm really confident in my place as a classical music listener, and I basically think I kind of 90% just think this is a funny story, I actually think there's a really high likelihood of, if you do that to somebody in a concert hall, they may never go to a concert ever again.
Yes.
Because it's it's really embarrassing, and it's not how we treat adults. And ideally not how we treat children either, but
it's a solemn occasion.
We must behave appropriately.
We have to be very solemn.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
the opening of a spoof opera right
funny.
now. I know, and I think there's a really, really serious point about belonging and feeling like we belong in a space. And for people who are relatively privileged or relatively already in that crowd, for me as a person who's grown up around classical music, I have no problem with my presence in a classical music space at all. But for people who don't feel like they belong there, they may never go. And if they do go and then they experience something like that, we need to be able to walk into concert halls and still feel like us. Whether that's parents, whether it's, people of a different racial or economic background or anything like that.
That's a hugely important thing you've just said. It's absolutely massive, that the ability to feel like yourself when you walk in, and the feeling of freedom, and the notion that it's a passionate thing, classical music. It's incredibly passionate, and it should be filled with freedom as well. You just can't have the one without the other. You cannot be straitjacketed and have a passionate
and you have to be able to
experience.
react. And it's so, we've all been at those concerts that have just floored us emotionally. I remember I went to a production of Bohème once when I was at uni with a big group from uni, and I was going through something. A friend of a friend had died recently, and I was it wasn't really top emotion for me because it wasn't sort of my friend, but there was a lot going on. Obviously there's an effect. Yeah. And then the person I was sitting next to as well, I don't know what was going on in her life at the time, but both of us sat and absolutely, it must have been the 6th or 8th production of Bohème I'd seen. It's very tear-jerking, but I wasn't, I wasn't necessarily expecting it, but we both just sat and wept throughout the entire production, from the first note. We were just completely gone. And the whole thing, I was just sat there going, oh my God, this is embarrassing. But it can do that to you, and it's incredibly cathartic, and you need it. Yeah, exactly.
So cathartic. Bohème is the ultimate tearjerker from first moment to last. Of course.
Everything.
So quite right. You got it all out, and you still remember that production. There you go.
That was probably 12 years
right
ago,
into.
and I'll never forget that. Absolutely, because it meant a huge amount, and I personally don't want to only consume art or entertainment or whatever you want to call it that's like that, that's on a level. You want the ups and downs because that's what it's for.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Totally. But in a way, for me, the running, running a show for a long time, it allows you to do what people do on Broadway all the time. So, for example, in America, it's a vast country. People will go to New York just to do kind of a Broadway hop, go from theater to theater, production to production. And I would love to do that with classical music, with opera, just to be able to hit 20 performances in a week, and endlessly ongoing this bouquet of potential emotional experiences that you have at your fingertips. You don't have to wait 3 years for some opera house to do the show that you want to see, but that you have things turning. I think there could be a lot more live performance, and perhaps in less traditional venues. And now with COVID, we have to space things differently than we're used to, and yet it becomes that much more challenging to make ends meet, because reduced audiences mean that these very expensive productions simply cannot break even.
And running them for longer
creative rearranging. We have to run them for longer, and we have to rearrange the space, and we have to possibly look at ending the tyranny of the most famous singers making so many times more than other classical singers, and there is this phenomenon. When I was living in France, an events organizer told me that Cecilia Bartoli, whom I love, came to town, and this town's arts budget for a year was wiped out in a single performance. So they spent every penny they had for a year of programming to hear a single concert by Cecilia Bartoli, because it was that expensive. And I'm sorry, but they should have taken the year of arts programming. It's great, and no one is so significant that it can buy that. And it was all about the prestige. It was not that the experience was so overwhelmingly emotional to hear her live, as opposed to the umpteen videos that are available. It really was the prestige of this town bringing her there. And
it's just about the cost, isn't it? If they can't make her fee plus, whatever back in audience numbers, then it's not, it's just not worth it, no matter who they are. And this is where the music, the models that the music business use are a bit bonkers, because they do
completely bonkers.
In
and
general,
it is
they don't
the
pay enough for anything,
game.
But then sometimes they pay way too much for all the wrong things.
Exactly. They pay either too much by factor of 10 or not enough. And there's very little in between, which is really mad. That and because there is the prestige factor of classical music, is just too, and I think this is also quite a new phenomenon as well, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there have always been, I'm not suggesting that everyone should be paid the same. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not at all an anti-capitalist, anti-market person, quite the contrary. I think those forces tend to be very useful, actually. But not in this completely absurdist way, and by the same token, administrators, the exact same way that CEOs of major companies now make 10 times more than they could or should, given any kind of meritocratic normal system for what they do, which isn't to say they should make exactly the same as everyone else, but they shouldn't make 1,000 times more, 100 times more. There has to be some kind of, even with a gradation of superstars all the way down to the young artists starting out, It doesn't have to be that someone makes 80 grand for a performance and another person makes 500 pounds. It's just too wide a swing.
And there's a part of it that's to do with markets, and yes, obviously big names attract audiences, and then there is a way of putting an actual figure on that and working out what that should mean. But I also think we have a duty as people who work in it, who provide, who kind of are the bones of the music industry. Opera houses and music organisations and anyone else has a duty to kind of look at this from the point of view of the performer and their career. So you sort of like say, I was talking to someone yesterday who had been discouraged from going into the music professional music as a violinist because their parents thought that they were, the best they could do would be a desk job in an orchestra, which is obviously like a great achievement for a lot of musicians, but there was this perception. I don't have any, I have seen many views on that particular issue, but the perception was that that's not like actually a good kind of end goal financially or career wise, or that was the perception of this person's parents who'd said that. But similarly, it is rooted in some truth in the sense that actually, if that is the holy grail of work for so many people, what does it actually mean when it's got there? Does it mean that you can live in one place? Does it mean you can afford to buy a house in that place? Can you raise your family? Do you have time to see them? If your parents are ill, can you look after them? What happens if the orchestra isn't performing? It's like there's all of these things that are to do with just people living well and being happy and having choices, because obviously not everyone wants family, etc., etc. That's absolutely fine, but it's about having choices. And ultimately, artists, I believe, are faced with a choice between sort of like types of career and types of lifestyle. If you see what I mean. So, it's like you either, it was like you said at the beginning of the interview, you either don't have kids or you do and you never see them, or potentially you just don't do the work and you choose the family, and then, it's perceived as the person who's lost out on the work, but it's not. It's the industry has lost out on this artist because they could not support their right to have life choices, essentially.
I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And it's exactly what happened to me. I had two sons very young, and I stayed home to raise them because I just couldn't face not doing that. And it almost cost me my career. I began to travel a great deal when they were older, feeling horrendously guilty. But there was no choice, or that would have been entirely too late. But I waited until the younger one was 9 and the older one was 12 to do it. And even so, it was agony to do it. And it's really a terrible choice to be confronted with. And the solution to that is to go back to the old system, which has another great advantage, especially the time of COVID, that everyone's not traveling all the time. And that is that when you have a kind of local diva who is raised in an opera house and who goes through the old Italian system, you would study from childhood with a master singer. You would start in the chorus. You would then take the smaller roles in an opera house. You would then learn and graduate to the larger roles in a house. And along with that, you built up your own audience base and your own loyal audience base who wanted to see you in productions and who then came to everything you did. And this was kind of something that was a feature in everyone's life, both in the performers and the audience's life. And these local singers were huge stars in their day. And it's such a healthy way of living, and everyone had a normal life. They traveled sometimes, and there was an exchange, and people would go do concerts, and there were traveling groups of singers who went other places and performed. But fundamentally, your life was in one place where you could build your life and have your kids and do all those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And, I think I sometimes think that the hospitality kind of factor in music has kind of originated from the need for people to have, there's like this whole thing of people of, like, for example, touring artists being demanding, but I really don't see it in most cases as being demanding to to need things and to need comfort to be put in place when you're not spending a lot of time at home. Do you know what I mean? Because
that depends. I was singing in Brazil some years ago, and it so happened that I never signed a Brazilian contract, and my agent in France had no idea what to do with it. And so I asked the organizers for the kind of contract that they wanted. And so they quite indiscreetly sent me the contract of a soprano superstar who had sung there before me. And I laughed so hard because it was the specifics that she wanted, a certain kind of herbal tea, a certain humidity level in the room, a kind of, it's just hilarious. Absolutely hilarious.
I know, but do you not? I mean, but maybe she'd just been everywhere, had always been freezing or something, and she was like,
it was all a power play. It was all a power play, and strictly very common among Hollywood types that the agent will stick riders in the contract that are completely unnecessary, but just to kind of to make the people who are hiring feel like they're getting a more valuable commodity when an artist. But these are not games I particularly approve of, in case you haven't guessed.
Yeah, no, but, absolutely. Yeah, certainly arbitrary games and all.
There's a price to pay for all these.
But yet we can ask, or our agents can ask for certain types of herbal tea, but we can't say we need, instead of a hotel room, we need like an apartment so that our family can come with us, you know, that kind of thing. It's like the things that we feel we can ask for and the things that we don't. It's quite something.
Well, it's the marvelous German tenor Jonas Kaufmann talking about, I heard an interview where he talked about the fact that everywhere he goes he rents a flat, and he always brings his toolbox because he's always fixing something in the apartment that he rents. And so his little travel toolbox.
Tenant.
Yeah, I mean, it's not wonderful. What a wonderful tenor. He is a wonderful tenor, but also very useful. Handyman.
I said tenant, not tenor, but yes, that's
tenor. He's the best kind of things. Yeah. Tenor tenant. Yeah, the tenor tenant.
Oh, wonderful. I feel like we could carry on talking about this for hours, but do you think, was there anything else you wanted to get off your chest about the classical music industry before we round off?
Oh, I think the biggest thing, the most important thing, is this. And the irony of this situation. I once went to the opera. I sneaked into the opera directors. So there's a kind of league of opera directors across Europe, and they have a yearly meeting in a different location. And I went years ago to one in Barcelona, and the topic of that conference was innovation in opera. And I went to that conference because I had commissioned and created the libretto. I actually adapted the libretto out of an extraordinary literary work, a vampire love story. And I commissioned the composer who'd written for me, Eskander Bikmambetov, to write an opera ballet score. And I'm absolutely convinced that what we had on our hands was a work of absolute genius. He's an extraordinary composer. And so I was trying to find a house who would premiere it. As it happens, English National Ballet almost premiered it. The then director resigned. It's still unpremiered as we talk. But I wanted to show it to people, shop it around to people at that conference. And the one thing that became clear in that conference, and I actually stood up in front of the whole room full of these people and said, how, if one has a genius project, we spent 5 years creating this work, 5 years. And it's very frustrating to have a masterpiece burning a hole in your pocket. And how does one present it? How can I? And I was shut down on the spot. There's absolutely no way to do that. And I had a friend who is a very successful opera director in France who'd worked under Nicolas Joël, and so he knew who ran the Bastille for years. And so he knew everybody who shopped this project around. And the response he got from every single opera director he turned to was that we're not even going to look at this because it's not our idea, because we didn't commission the work. And I said, but that's a huge advantage that they didn't spend £1 million. They spent zero. All they have to do is listen to the recording. And if they like it, it cost them nothing. What a huge advantage. But no, to them, the entire act of creation is an ego trip. It's all about them getting the credit for a new idea they could never have had. Because the creative act has to be given back to the creatives in our industry. And this is an absolutely crucial point. If we want audiences to come back to us and to really engage with classical music, the impetus for creating something new has to be an actual urge to create something specific. And the people who have those urges are artists. They're not administrators, generally speaking. They are not people designated by the political heads of a town at the time who also give the opera houses or orchestras the budget to create new works. It's all coming from the wrong place, and that is why so much of it is so bad. And if there's anything at all that we can change, it really is that the art world has to fall back into the hands of artists. We have to find a way of engaging new audiences. We have to allow them to bring themselves to the process, because the audience is not a passive person when they're seeing a work of art. They participate. Things are required of them, and much more emotionally than intellectually. People think that it's intellectual engagement, and that's why they get so frightened that what if they don't have the goods? What if they're not intellectual enough, or not intellectually prepared enough, or not smart enough to understand this mysterious quagmire of classical music? Not true at all. It's never their fault. If the audience isn't engaged, it's always the fault of the people who are not managing to engage ordinary people. And classical music absolutely is for everybody. And I'm really hoping that the COVID meltdown, this utter disaster, and possibly the disappearance of so many of the great institutions of classical music that we're seeing going out of business now, I really hope and believe that this will open the door for a new dawn of creation. I really, really hope that is what will happen, and new audiences will come in, and the whole thing will be freed from the shackles of the classical music industry. Classical music is the best thing in the world. The classical music industry, not so much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If there's one thing I hope comes out of the pandemic, which has been completely devastating in so many ways, it's that we all learn an awful lot about how we do things in classical music and in other ways as well, and you know that can learn from those changes, and that society can make changes. And I really, I don't hold out much hope, frankly, for certain areas of that, but but classical music does feel like something. I don't know. I feel as though there is a hopeful movement. Maybe that's because I'm just surrounding myself around by people who think that as well. But I feel as though there is a
hang on. It's up to us to do it.
Absolutely,
it's up to us to do it. So
how would you?
And
how
I'm going
would
to
you
try
eradicate...
to do it.
Yeah, me too. Indeed. So I haven't warned you about this, so this might not be. But how would you get real equality of opportunity back into the classical music industry?
Well, there are several things. The first thing is to make sure to bring as much meritocracy back to the proceeding as humanly possible, and that means that auditions need to be decided by musicians, the outcomes of auditions. That alone would change so much. There has to be a freedom of creation. I hope the balance of new works to established works would shift to at least half and half. That would be fantastic. I love the old works. I don't want to see them disappear. But I would love to see many more performances. I think there are far too many blank holes in performing arts schedules. I feel like we could all earn less money but perform much more often. This is not the case for orchestral musicians, by the way, because the freelancers, they're playing all the time. But I'd almost rather that each organization provided a lot more work at a lot lower rates. I'd be absolutely willing to sing for lower fees, but more, and for more and more audiences. It's really about getting bums on seats. It's getting the audiences back into the theaters, and the theaters don't have to be theaters. It can be any space with that works acoustically can become a performance space. And we don't have to tether people to their chairs either. So we have to have a really think about how to engage new spaces and new audiences in completely different formats. And to do that, I think we should have a lot of programs with a great deal of variety and a lot of different performers and a lot of flavors. And I mentioned the Tony Popano broadcasts from the stage of the Royal Opera House. I saw one and was utterly delighted with it. It was actually the first live stream performance I'd seen this entire lockdown, because I just can't do it. I miss the live aspect too much. But he did it so charmingly, and I love talking. I'm a huge fan. When I sing concerts, I often talk to the audience and explain things and give them little anecdotes. Audiences tend to really enjoy that. Tony Popano does it very, very skillfully and very entertainingly. So it's really not rocket science. It's about engaging people emotionally and giving them much, much more than they could ever hope to get out of that experience. And they'll know it when they've got it. It's not like they're stupid and they're not going to realize that they're being given something special. When people get something special that blows their minds, they will react accordingly. So it's up to us to do that and to create performance opportunities, to price it in a way that allows people to come, to keep costs down whenever possible, to find new ways of, well, now that we have the whole streaming video possibilities of bringing things into their home. I would love to do a modern version of this American Bell Hour opera program, and there's so much that can be done, so much, and it's up to us to do it, and we will try, do my utmost.
We will, absolutely. Thank you so much for
thank you so much, Katie,
for coming. That is a really, really good to talk about that. And brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we'll leave it there. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening today. To find out what we're up to, do join our mailing list or follow us on social media. And if you'd like to support the podcast by buying me a coffee, you can do that on buymeacoffee.com. Thank you so much. See you next time.